Neo-Druidism and Neo-Druidry, commonly referred to as Druidry by many adherents, is a form of modern spirituality, a religion that generally promotes harmony and worship of nature, and respect for all beings, including the environment. Many forms of modern Druidry are neo-pagan religions, whereas some are instead seen as philosophies that are not necessarily religious in nature. Originating in Britain during the 18th century, Druidry was originally a cultural movement, only gaining religious or spiritual connotations in the 19th century. The core principle of Druidry is respect and veneration of nature, and as such it often involves participation in the environmental movement. Another prominent belief among modern Druids is the veneration of ancestors, particularly those who belonged to prehistoric societies, arising from the 18th century Romanticist movement in Britain, which glorified the ancient Celtic peoples of the Iron Age. The early Druids aimed to imitate the Iron Age priests, who were also known as Druids. At the time, little accurate information was known about these ancient priests, and the modern Druidic movement has no direct connection to them, despite contrary claims made by some modern Druids. In the late 18th century, modern Druids developed fraternal organizations modeled on Freemasonry that employed the romantic figure of the British Druids and bards as symbols of indigenous British spirituality. Some of these groups were purely fraternal and cultural, creating traditions from the national imagination of Britain. Others, in the early 20th century, merged with contemporary movements such as the physical culture era movement and naturism. Since the 1980s, some modern Druid groups have adopted similar methodologies to those of Celtic Reconstructionist paganism in an effort to create a more historically accurate practice. However, there is still controversy over how much resemblance modern Druidism may or may not have to the Iron Age Druids' beliefs. Neo-Druidic beliefs vary widely, and there is no set dogma or belief system followed by all adherents. Indeed, it is a key component of many Druidic groups that there should not be strict dogmas. There is no central authority over the entire movement, nor any central religious text or religious leader. Core ideas shared by many Druids, according to Emma Restelor, the founder of the Druid network, include honoring of the ancestors and honoring of the land. Or also commented that Druidry connects with all the other Earth ancestor traditions around the globe, such as the Native American, the Maori and Huna, the Aboriginal, the Romani and the indigenous spiritualities of Africa and Asia, a view supported by leading British Druid Philip Cargom. Nature-centered spirituality Druidry largely revolves around the veneration of nature. Phil Ryder stated that, within Druidry, nature is considered to be unconditionally sacred and an expression and manifestation of deity and divinity. Many Druids are animists. Most Druids see the aspects of nature as imbued with spirit or soul, whether literally or metaphorically. Some Druids consider animals and plants to be members, like the deities of the Celts, of a Tuath, or tribe, and therefore honored. Celtic author J. A. McCulloch wrote of this in depth in a book published in 1911 entitled Religion of the Ancient Celts. Because they view the natural world as sacred, many Druids are involved in environmentalism, thereby acting to protect areas of the natural landscape that are under threat from development or pollution. Theology. The theology of the modern Druidic movement is inherently nature-based, equating divinity with the natural world. However, the specifics of Druidry have changed over the centuries, from a god-centered monotheistic tradition to a goddess-centered polytheistic tradition. Since Druidry is very diverse, each of these strands still coexists side by side in the Druid milieu. Monotheism. When modern Druidry developed into a religion in Britain during the 18th century, the country was almost entirely entirely Christian, with most of the populace still believing in a monotheistic god. Even by the end of the 19th century, Druidry was still being described as a monotheistic philosophical tradition, but that later changed radically in the 20th century, with the burgeoning growth of the pagan revivalist movement, as pagan Druids today worship a number of different gods and goddesses. Neo-Pagan theology and the goddessum Druids, such as members of RN are polytheists worshipping many gods and goddesses, who are worthy of respect, love and worship. These deities are commonly taken from historical Celtic polytheism, though can also come from other sources, such as Christianity. The goddess Danu gives her name to the family of Irish deities, which in the Gaelic is the Tuatha Dé Acute Danan. With the increase in Neo-Pagan Druidry, and the widespread acceptance of goddess worship, the Druids' prayer, which had been originally written in the 18th century by Druid Ilo Morganwg, had the word God replaced with goddess in common usage, although not universally. A middle ground is found in the order of bards, ovates and druids, where the word spirit is used very frequently. Ancestor veneration. Respect for the ancestors is another core belief for some Druids. This idea of respect for ancestors, or ancestor worship, is common in pagan folk religions. Revivalists and Reconstructionists agree that knowing as much as possible about the lives of our ancestors and preserving national or tribal heritage is important and good. Archaeological evidence does suggest that the ancient peoples of Britain, Ireland, and other parts of Europe practiced burial customs from which we infer particular respect for ancestors and probably a belief in life after death, in some form. The Druids' ancestor veneration generally focuses on the Iron Age Celtic peoples of Western Europe, because these were the peoples among whom the ancient Druids lived. This offers a connection to the Celts through a blood link to a modern Celtic land or merely a soul allegiance. Some Druids, however, particularly those with no ethnic connection, do not emphasize such a Celtic link, and focus instead on other historical peoples, such as the Anglo-Saxons of the Norse. Ancestor veneration leads many to object to the archaeological excavation of human remains and the subsequent display in museums. Many have organized campaigns for the reburial. For instance, in 2006, a Neo-Druid called Paul Davies requested that the Alexander Cayley Museum in Avebury, Wiltshire rebury the human remains, and that storing and displaying them was immoral and disrespectful. Criticism of this view has come from the archaeological community, with statements like no single modern ethnic group or cult should be allowed to appropriate our ancestors for their own agendas. It is for the international scientific community to curate such remains. Afterlife. Emeresta Law stated that there is a general acceptance of reincarnation among Druids, and that a soul can reincarnate into any species. However, Oars claimed that this is nearly universal among Druids is not supported. There is no discussion of the afterlife or reincarnation. For example, in the writings of the Reformed Druids of North America, practices, ceremonies. The practices of modern Druids typically take place outside, in the daylight, in what is described as the eye of the sun. In some cases, they instead perform the rites indoors or during the night. Most Druids perform ceremonies within a circle around an altar, a central fire. Neo-Druids often meet and practice in groups called variously groves or henges. Sometimes they meet at pre-Celtic stone circles and other megaliths, which since the Romantic Revival have been associated in the popular imagination with the ancient Druids. At the summer solstice, a Neo-Druidic ritual is notably held at Stonehenge in England. Another particularly sacred place is Glastonbury in southern England. In parts of the world beyond the range of the original Celtic tribes in Europe and the pre-Celtic megalithic Neolithic cultures. Modern Druids seek an understanding of the sacred qualities of landscape and place. When performing rituals, some modern Druids wear ceremonial cloaks and robes, which in some cases imitate the Iron Age style of the Celts. In some orders, robes or tabards of different colors are used to indicate the grade of the Druid within the order. In the case of the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids, the colors blue, green, and white are respectively assigned to these grades. Some modern Druids also use ritual staves, a symbolic magical instrument long associated with both Druids and wizards generally. Many modern Druids do not adopt any ceremonial garb. In the 1990s and early 2000s, the use of a ritual based on the sweat lodge became increasingly popular among some Neo-Druids in Ireland and the UK. The sweat lodge is a ceremony common to many indigenous peoples of the Americas. It has been appropriated by some adherents of Neo-Druidism who see sweats as initiatory and regenerative opportunities to rededicate oneself to honoring the earth and the community of life. Quote, however, Native Americans who preserve the sweat lodge ceremonies for the communities have protested the appropriation of the ceremony by non-natives. Increasingly so now that people have been injured and some have died in fraudulent sweat lodge ceremonies performed by non-natives. Arts and poetry. In Druidry, a specific ceremony takes place known as an Eistedd, which is dedicated to the recitation of poetry and musical performances. Within the Druidic community, practitioners who are particularly skilled in the recitation of poetry and the performance of music are referred to as bards, a term based upon the word bardois, which the ancient Greek historian Strabo claimed was the term for poets in Iron Age Gaul. Bards perform at Eistedd at various occasions, from formal rituals to pub get-togethers and summer camps and environmental protests. Instruments commonly used by Druidic bards include acoustic stringed instruments like the guitar and the clarinet, as well as the bodhran, bagpipe, rattle, flute and whistle. Academic Graham Harvey believed that these specific instruments were preferred by modern Druids because many of them were Irish in origin, and therefore gave a Celtic flavor, seemingly invoking the Iron Age, the period during which the ancient Druids lived. Inspiration for poetry and other arts is known as Arwen, and is believed to be a flowing spirit given by the goddess, which can be invoked by the Druid. In many Druidic rituals, Arwen is invoked by either chanting the word Arwen or Aio 3 times, in order to shift the consciousness of the participants involved. Druids have participated in other musical genres and with more technological instruments, including the blues and rave music, and one British club, Megatripolis, opened with the performance of a Druidic ritual. Tree lore. Among many Druids, there is a system of tree lore, through which different associations are attributed to different species of tree, including particular moods, actions, phases of life, deities and ancestors. Festivals. Most adherents of Neo-Druidism observe 8 spiritual festivals a year, which are collectively known as the Wheel of the Year. In some cases, groups attempt to revive folkloric European festivals and their accompanying traditions. In other cases, the rites are modern inventions, inspired by the spirit of what they believe was the religious practice of pre-Roman Britain. 4 of these are solar festivals, being positioned at the solstices and equinoxes. These are largely inspired by Germanic paganism. The other 4 are the Celtic festivals, the cross-quarter days, inspired by modern interpretations of ancient Celtic polytheism. The idea of the Wheel of the Year was introduced into Druidry by Ross Nichols, who founded the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids in 1964, and he had gained this idea from his friend Gerald Gardner, who had implemented it in his Bricketwood Coven of Gardnerian Witches in 1958. History. Origins. The Druidic movement originated among the Romanticist ideas of the ancient Druids that had begun to be developed in the 17th and 18th centuries, while many early medieval writers, particularly in Ireland, had demonized the ancient Druids as barbarians who had practiced human sacrifice and tried to suppress the coming of Christianity. Certain late medieval writers had begun to extol what they believed were the virtues of the Druids, and reinvented them as national heroes, particularly in Germany, France and Scotland. It was also during this period that Conrad Celtis had begun to propagate the image of the Druids as having been bearded, wise old men wearing white robes, something that would prove highly influential in future centuries. The image of the Iron Age Druids as national heroes would later begin to emerge in England during the early modern period, with the antiquarian and Anglican vicar William Stukeley proclaiming himself to be a Druid and writing a number of popular books in which he claimed that prehistoric megaliths like Stonehenge and Avebury were temples built by the Druids, something now known to be incorrect. Stukeley himself, being a devout but unorthodox Christian, felt that the ancient Druids had been followers of a monotheistic faith very similar to Christianity, at one point even stating that ancient Druidry was so extremely like Christianity that in effect, it differed from it only in this: they believe in a Messiah who was to come into the world, as we believe in him that is come. Soon after the publication and spread of Stukeley's writings, other people also began to self-describe themselves as Druids, and formed societies. The earliest of these was the Druidic Society, founded on the Welsh island of Anglesey in 1772. Largely revolving around ensuring the continued financial success of business on the island. It attracted many of Anglesey's wealthy inhabitants into it, and donated much of its proceeds to charity, but was disbanded in 1844. A similar Welsh group was the Society of the Druids of Cardigan, founded circa 1779, largely by a group of friends who wished to attend literary picnics together. The third British group to call itself Druidic was English rather than Welsh, and was known as the Ancient Order of Druids, founded in 1781 and influenced by Freemasonry. Its origins have remained somewhat unknown, but it subsequently spread in popularity from its base in London across much of Britain and even abroad, with new lodges being founded, all of which were under the control of the Central Head Lodge in London. The order was not religious in structure, and instead acted as somewhat of a social club, particularly for men with a common interest in music. In 1833 it suffered a schism, as a large number of dissenting lodges, unhappy at the management of the order, formed their own united Ancient Order of Druids, and both groups would go on to grow in popularity throughout the rest of the century. Development of religious Druidry. None of the earliest modern Druidic groups had been religious in structure. However, this was to change in the late 18th century, primarily because of the work of a Welshman who took the name of Iarla Morgan Oog. Born as Edward Williams, he would take up the cause of Welsh nationalism, and was deeply opposed to the British monarchy, supporting many of the ideals of the French Revolution, which had occurred in 1789. Eventually moving to London, he began perpetuating the claim that he was actually one of the last initiates of a surviving group of Druids who were descended from those found in the Iron Age. Centered on his home county of Glamorgan, he subsequently organized the performing of Neo-Druidic rituals on Primrose Hill with some of his followers, whom he categorized as either bards or ovates, with he himself being the only one actually categorized as a Druid. He himself practiced a form of religion he believed the ancient Druids had, which involved the worship of a singular monotheistic deity as well as as the acceptance of reincarnation. Morganwg's example was taken up by other Welshmen in the 19th century, who continued to promote religious forms of Druidry. The most prominent figure in this was William Price, a physician who held to ideas such as vegetarianism and a political Chartist movement. His promotion of cremation and open practice of it led to his arrest and trial, but he was acquitted, achieving a level of fame throughout Britain. He would declare himself to be a Druid, and would do much to promote the return of what he believed was an ancient religion in his country. In 1874, Robert Wentworth Little, a Freemason who achieved notoriety as the first supreme magus of the occult societies Rosicrucian, allegedly founded the ancient and archaeological order of Druids, which, like the societies Rosicrucian, was an esoteric organization. Meanwhile, at the start of the 20th century, Druidic groups began holding the ceremonies at the great megalithic monument of Stonehenge in Wiltshire, England. The historian Ronald Hutton would later remark that it was a great and potentially uncomfortable irony that modern Druids had arrived at Stonehenge just as archaeologists were evicting the ancient Druids from it, as they realized that the structure dated from the Neolithic and early Bronze Age, millennia before the Iron Age, when the Druids first appear in the historical record. Neo-Pagan Druidry in Britain. The most important figure for the rise of Neo-Pagan Druidry in Britain was Ross Nichols, a member of the Druid order. In 1964 he split off to found the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids. In 1988 Philip Cargom was asked to lead the order. Another significant figure in the British Neo-Pagan Druidic movement is Emma Restelaw, who was a senior member of OBOD. In 1993 she became Joint Chief of the British Druid Order, staying until 2002. Together with the order founder Philip Shallcross, she developed the BDO into one of the largest and most influential of its time. Feeling the system of orders too limiting, in 2002 she created the Druid Network, which was officially launched at Holbeach 2003. Druidry in North America. The earliest American Druid organizations were fraternal orders such as the United Ancient Order of Druids and the American Order of Druids. The former was a branch of a British organization that had split from the Ancient Order of Druids, while the latter was founded in Massachusetts in 1888. Both were forms of fraternal benefit societies rather than religious and neo-pagan groups. In 1963, the Reformed Druids of North America was founded by students at Carleton College, Northfield, Minnesota, a liberal arts college that required its members to attend some form of religious services. As a form of humorous protest against this rule, a group of students, who contained Christians, Jews and agnostics within the ranks, decided to create their own, non-serious religious group. The protest was successful, and the requirement was scrapped in 1964. Nonetheless, the group continued holding services, which were not considered neo-pagan by most members, but instead thought of an interreligious nature. From its beginning, the RDNA revolved around the veneration of the natural world, personified as Mother Earth, holding that religious truth could be found through nature. They had also adopted other elements of neo-paganism into the practices, for instance celebrating the festivals of the Wheel of the Year, which they had borrowed from the neo-pagan religion of Wicca. While the RDNA had become a success, with new branches or groves being founded around the United States, the many neo-pagan elements of the RDNA eventually rose to prominence, leading several groves to actively describe themselves as neo-pagan. This was opposed by several of the group's founders, who wanted it to retain its into religious origins, and certain groves actually emphasized the connection to other religions. There was a group of Zen Druids in Olympia and Hasidic Druids in St. Louis, for instance. Among those largely responsible for this transition towards neo-paganism within the organization were Isaac Bonewits and Robert Larson, who worked in a grove located in Berkeley, California, believing that the Reformed Druidic movement would have to accept that it was essentially neo-pagan in nature. Bonewits decided to found a split-off group known as the New Reformed Druids of North America, which he defined as an eclectic reconstructionist neo-pagan priestcraft, based primarily upon Gaulish and Celtic sources. Bonewits still felt that many in the RDNA were hostile towards him, believing that he had infiltrated the group, and so in 1985 he founded a new, explicitly neo-pagan Druidic group, RN-Druidry, and began publishing a journal, The Druid's Progress, arguing that it should draw from pan-European sources, rather than just those that were considered Celtic. He placed an emphasis on academic and scholarly accuracy, taking a stand against what he perceived as the prevalent pseudo-historical ideas of many neo-pagans and Druids. In 1986, several members of RN-Druidry openly criticized Bonewits for his pan-European approach, wishing modern Druidism to be inspired purely by Celtic sources, and so they splintered off to form a group called the Henge of Celtria, the ancient order of Druids in America, currently headed by pagan author and Druid John Michael Greer, was founded as the Ancient Order of Masonic Druids in America in 1912 in Boston, Massachusetts. The founder, James Manchester, had obtained a charter from the Ancient Order of Masonic Druids of England. AOMD started in 1874 as the Ancient Archaeological Order of Druids by Robert Wentworth Little, the founder of Societas Rosicruciana in Anglia. SRIA is the immediate predecessor organization of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. In 1972, the Ancient Order of Masonic Druids in America changed its name to the current name, the Ancient Order of Druids in America, and started initiating women, which it had not done so previously because of its Masonic origin. It was also at this time that AOMD denied ever having recognized AOMDA and wasn't interested in doing so at the time. Demographics. According to the American Religious Identification Survey, there are approximately 30,000 Druids in the United States. There are approximately 50,000 Druids worldwide. On November 1, 1980, Gwynlyn Lascaux became the Grand Druid of Brittany, at the head of Gorsez Bridge, the Fraternity of Druids, Bards and Ovates of Brittany, founded in 1908. Gwynlyn is sometimes also considered the Grand Druid of France. The Italian Druid Order was founded in 2009 and affiliated to the English Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids. The 2001 UK census was the first to ask a voluntary question about religion. The results did not allow an accurate breakdown of traditions within the pagan heading, as a campaign by the Pagan Federation before the census encouraged Wiccans, heathens, Druids and others all to use the same right-in term pagan in order to maximize the numbers reported. Nevertheless, 1,657 people in the UK described themselves as Druid in 2001. The 2011 census allowed for more accurate responses. The figures for England and Wales show that 4,189 people described themselves as Druid. In September 2010, the Charity Commission for England and Wales agreed to register the Druid network as a charity, effectively giving it official recognition as a religion.